We're going to take a look at the Cubical Quad. The Cubical Quad antenna was conceived probably around about 1940, and it's an interesting antenna actually. But William Orr, W6SAI, once wrote many years ago, "The Cubical Quad is either the most amazing antenna ever conceived or a complete hoax." And then he went on to say that probably it was somewhere in between those rather extreme limits. So let's take a look at the Cubical Quad. The birthplace of the Quad took place in Ecuador at radio station HCJB, which today is still transmitting. HCJB was high up in the mountains in Ecuador, and it was primarily aimed at spreading the gospel to various parts of the world. And HCJB, I think, started around about 1932 with a simple 100 watt or 200 watt, I think it was, transmitter. It then increased its power to 1000 watts to increase its range, and the operation was primarily on the 25 metre broadcast band. And then the decision was made to increase the power considerably to 10,000 watts. And that's where the problem occurred, and that is when the Cubical Quad was developed. So let me explain what actually happened in those days when HCJB decided to increase its power to a mighty 10,000 watts. Not only did the engineers want to increase the power to 10,000 watts, they also wanted to increase the range and the signal strength of the station. And so they erected a 4-element Yagi. Now this was a fixed antenna, but it was a 4-element Yagi, but they used some pretty thick aluminium tubing to construct this Yagi. And when they tested it, it worked extremely well. It gave really good signal strength to the parts of the world they were aiming for, and initially they were quite happy. But then they noticed that there was a problem with the antenna. During the day it seemed to work fine, but as nightfall came and the temperature dropped and there was dew falling, they noticed there was a corona discharge at the end of the elements. And this discharge was noisy, could be heard apparently a quarter of a mile away, but more concerningly, it was starting to melt the tips of the antenna. Now at the tips of a Yagi there's a very high voltage, and if the conditions are right, and I guess there's low air pressure, whatever, the corona discharge takes place. And it's quite alarming. Now I've only ever seen a corona discharge once, and that was around about the 1990s when I was over in Dayton, Ohio, and they had, I think it was on the Yaesu stand actually, they had a motorcycle mobile station, and this mobile station was running a kilowatt, yes, a kilowatt of power. The motorcycle had a trailer behind it. On the trailer behind it was a power supply. I think it was a diesel generator and a 1 kilowatt amplifier. And it was just after the show had finished for the day. This guy fired it up inside the hall, and we saw this glow at the end of the mobile whip, just sort of glowing, and like it was quite attractive actually, quite sort of an attractive display, but also quite noisy. And I thought, wow, I wouldn't like to ride a motorcycle with that behind me. So that was the first time I saw a corona discharge display. It's quite amazing, quite a nice little firework display, but it also does damage. And that's what they found in Ecuador, that this Yagi system, this 4-element Yagi, which was supposedly going to solve the problem, didn't solve the problem. In fact, it caused a problem. And the next thing was, how do you deal with this corona discharge? How do you solve the problem of your antenna that's melting? Well, what happened was that the station HCJB put out a call for help to solve the problem of their melting antennas. And a team of engineers was gathered together, headed by Clarence Moore, W9LZX. He was quite a capable engineer, but he admitted that he really had no idea how to solve the problem. So apparently he took a pile of radio books with him, and they pored over these radio books for several days trying to come up with a solution. And as Clarence Moore said, he had a divine inspiration. He was in the right place. HCJB was a Christian radio station, and he reckoned he had this divine inspiration. He looked at something called the folded dipole. Now, I think a lot of people are familiar with the folded dipole, but the folded dipole has something rather interesting, and that is that because it's folded, it has a lower Q, and it is a complete circuit, and the voltage at the extremities is somewhat lower than the voltage at the ends of a conventional dipole. So he thought, wait a minute, this could be the solution. If we use a folded dipole, we could perhaps solve the problem. Although it probably didn't solve the problems on the parasitic elements. Anyway, he went one stage further. So what Clarence did, for whatever reason, he pulled this folded dipole open into a square loop. Each side was a quarter wave long, so he had a full wave loop that was going to be fed at the bottom. And this became the quad element. And he thought, what about adding a reflector? So he created another square loop, which was to be a reflector, and I guess that he knew that he had to tune that slightly lower in frequency, and that was the beginning of the cubical quad. But would it work? Yes, that was the question. Would it solve the problem? They all held their breath. They fed 10,000 watts into this quad antenna, and there was no corona discharge. But what happened at night? And as night fell, they continued to test this antenna, and lo and behold, there was no corona discharge. They'd solved the problem. And what is more, it seemed to be giving a similar forward gain to the 4-element Yagi that by this time had started to melt away quite significantly. And that really was the birth of the cubical quad. Now, it didn't take too long for ham radio operators, because Clarence was a ham himself, to learn about the cubical quad. And amateurs started to experiment and build their own. And William Orr, W6SAI, did some quite extensive work on the quad antenna, not so much developing it, but more the case of investigating it. And it's quite fascinating to learn what he found. The quad loop itself has several advantages. The first obvious one, of course, is it takes up far less lateral space. A 20-metre quad is going to have sides which are approximately 16 feet, which means to say it has a turning radius of 8 foot. That's just the loop on its own. It's a lower Q, so it has better bandwidth. A loop is also quieter. It was found that on receive, the loop was a quieter antenna. And it was also found that the loop gives you almost 1 dB of gain over a dipole. It's actually 0.9 dB. So 1 dB over a dipole is probably nothing to get too excited about, but nevertheless it is a 1 dB gain. So you could have a rotatable quad element, single element, and that would work quite well. There is a bit of a problem with feeding it, which we'll come back to, because it's got a higher impedance. You can't feed it directly with 50 ohm cable. Now, if you add a reflector to it, you get some gain in a similar way that you would get gain on a Yagi. But because the quad elements are lower Q, there's not quite so much gain. If we take the forward gain of a 2-element Yagi as being around about 6 dB, the reflector element on a quad only gives about 5 dB of forward gain, but it makes up that 1 dB difference by the fact that the driven element has got 1 dB gain. So in actual fact, a quad, a 2-element quad, is very similar to a 2-element Yagi, but with some of the advantages which I've just listed. Now, back in the late 1960s, early 70s, I can recall some experiments which took place, and it was found that a quad driven element worked very well with a normal straight dipole parasitic element, and that gave better performance. I haven't seen that mentioned recently, but I do recall having a conversation with the station, I think it was somewhere in Kent actually, and he was using a quad driven element with a normal parasitic reflector and director, and he found that he got very, very good performance. But as I say, I haven't seen anything of that in recent times. Now, like all antennas, the actual feed impedance varies depending on the height above the ground. If the lower element of the quad is 3/8 of a wave above the ground, then it has a feed impedance of around about 60 ohms. So it means to say that if that's the lower element, which on a 20-meter quad would be about 24 foot above the ground, if the center boom support of the quad was at 32 feet, then you would get a feed impedance of around about 60 ohms. If you raise the quad higher, it starts to creep up towards 70 ohms. But even so, it's not too far off to get a reasonable match, but the purist will probably want to add some sort of matching system to it. By the way, in terms of front to back ratio, you get something in excess of 20 dB, very similar to a Yagi. Now, what about the angle of radiation? Let's look at the 3/8 wave length height above ground. That's for the lower part of the element. At 3/8 wave above ground, we actually get an angle of radiation of 32 degrees. And if we raise the antenna to a half wave above ground, we get an angle of radiation of 26 degrees. If we go above that, the angle drops down, but we do get a higher angle lobe. And in fact, the lowest radiation angle you get with a quad, if it's really high up, so nearly a full wavelength, is around about 16 degrees. So I would say that if even a quad at a modest level is going to give you reasonable performance, because I've always found that the angle of radiation doesn't have to be as low as we believe it has to be. I regularly, on my G5RV, half-size 5RV, which is only around about 25 foot above the ground, I regularly work into the Pacific with no problems at all. And that's because we have multi-hop. So there we are. There's hope for those that haven't got the facility for high masts or high towers, etc. Now, when it comes to the configuration of a quad, the actual structure of it, quad is not so, shall I say, streamlined as a Yagi antenna. A Yagi antenna has fairly clean lines. A quad antenna, by its very nature, is a bit more like an octopus. It's got things going all over the place. It doesn't look quite the part, but of course it does perform very well. There are two ways of constructing a quad. You can have the central spider arrangement, whereby the support elements come out, or the support arms come out at angles. This works okay for a single band quad, although it's very difficult to actually get the angles right, so you get the spacing right for the forward gain. And it becomes even more complex with that form of structure if you have a multiband quad. Generally speaking, I think it's been found that a boom arrangement is by far the best arrangement. The boom arrangement enables you to slide the elements or the reflector along to a certain point where you get maximum gain, and it also makes the construction of a multi-band quad somewhat easier. So I think commercially they tend to favour the boom arrangement. Now Bill Orr, W6SAI, did some interesting tests on the quad, and this actually reflects the Yagi performance as well. If you have a reflector, and the reflector of course is tuned roughly 5% below the frequency of the active element, the driven element, you will find that the forward gain drops off rapidly as you go down the band, lower in frequency, in other words towards the frequency of the reflector. When you go in the opposite direction, the forward gain falls off much less rapidly. So it makes sense to actually resonate your antenna towards the lower part of the band, then adjust the reflector 5% approximately lower in frequency of that. And then what you'll find is that you'll get pretty good forward gain over most of the band. As I say, it will fall off more rapidly as you go lower in frequency, fall off far less rapidly as you go higher in frequency. And I just now put up on the screen a sort of a graph to show you what actually happens. Now, whilst the basis of a quad is very simple in terms of constructing, when it's a single band antenna, it becomes far more complicated when it's a multi-band antenna, because what actually happens is the elements of each band will affect elements of other bands. So the actual adjustment of the each element as regards resonant frequency really should be done when all the elements are in place. It becomes rather complex. I must admit I've never actually tried it myself, but listening and reading about reports of other hams that have made multiband quads, it can be a little time consuming to get the adjustment right, unless of course you can find somebody that's already done the work and you can take their measurements. As regards feeding a multiband quad, well, that also poses a bit of a problem really, and generally speaking it's accepted that the best way to feed a multiband quad is with separate feeder cables, and you can save on the length of the feeder by having an antenna switch. So if you've got a 3-band quad, have a 3-band remote antenna switch up towards the top of the mast, and that way you've got a single feeder going from the station to the mast, and then use that remote switch to select each band. That's the best way of doing it. Interestingly enough, if we go back to the 60s and 70s, it was quite popular to use bamboo canes as support arms for the quad. Bamboo was cheap, it was readily available, and it lasted quite a while actually. When I've been in the Far East, I've seen, particularly in Hong Kong, they use bamboo for scaffolding. It's quite rigid stuff, but I think nowadays the popular material for support arms is fiberglass. It'll last a lot longer. It's just as strong, and it may well be a bit lighter. So fiberglass is the way to go if you're going to build your own quad. Now, if you feel like building your own 20-metre single band quad, here are the dimensions that WSAI came up with. Each side of the loop should be 17 foot 7 inches. The space in between the driven element and the reflector should be 8 foot 5 inches. The feed impedance was 70 ohms, and the stub length for the reflector was between 34 and 38 inches, and the front to back ratio was 25 dB. Sorry, these are in feet and inches, but these are the measurements that Bill Orr put in his paper about the quad. Now, if we go back to the 60s and 70s, there was the Isle of Wight quad, and that used a trap system, which is quite interesting actually. If I remember rightly, my memory may be failing me a bit here, but although it definitely existed, I think it was a quad that covers 20 and 15 metres. The elements were loaded on the vertical, either side, the vertical sections of the quad were loaded with the coil. So the quad itself, I think the actual dimensions were for a full wave on 15 metres, and there was a coil, loading coil inserted that was shorted out, which gave resonance on 15 metres. If it was open circuit, then it loaded the element and it operated on 20 metres, and I think they used a shorting stub to automatically switch out the coil on the 15 metre band. But I can't find any details of it, but it was popular for a little while actually, and I do recall working stations that were using the Isle of Wight quad, but it hasn't survived the time as far as I know. Perhaps somebody's got one. If you've got one or know something about it, let me know. And that of course brings up the subject of, can you make a quad that is smaller in size? Well, if we follow the Isle of Wight idea, yes you can. You can put a pair of loading coils in circuit on the quad on the vertical sides and make the whole loop smaller. Probably it doesn't affect the efficiency too much. It will probably reduce the bandwidth somewhat, but I would say that you could have a modest reduction if you put loading coils in, and of course you need to put the loading coils in the reflector as well. By the way, it's very easy to adjust the reflector frequency. All you've got to do is to break the loop and put a analyzer in. You put a bit of coax to it, put an analyzer in, you'll probably get a pretty poor VSWR, but you're just looking for the resonant frequency, and that's a quick way of adjusting the reflector. So you could have a quad, a 20 metre quad that's the size of a 15 metre quad, for example. So what would that be? That would be sides of approximately 11 feet. 11 feet a side, overall length would be 44 feet. Significant reduction in size over the full size 20 metre one. That's assuming, of course, you want to operate on the 20 metre band. There we are. So where are we with the quad? Is it worth the effort? Well, I think probably it is worth the effort, actually. I think it's fallen out of favour because it is certainly a bit cumbersome, and it's probably not so weather resistant, particularly in terms of windy weather, compared with an aluminium constructed Yagi. But there are still a number of quads in use, and there are still some commercial firms manufacturing quads in the USA. And I think that if you can accept that it's a bit cumbersome, and perhaps accept that it's not quite so pleasing to look at as a Yagi, then it will give you good performance. And it's particularly easy to make if you are happy with a single band quad. And I suppose at the moment you could make a 10 metre quad, couldn't you? And it wouldn't be too big. You could also try and experiment with a single turn loop, a single quad loop. And you probably would get away with matching if you put a 4-to-1 balun at the feed point, and that would possibly work okay. Certainly the quad is an interesting antenna. You get some pretty good low angle radiation even at fairly low heights. So if you feel like doing a bit of construction work and you've got a means of supporting it, then by all means go ahead and give it a whirl. It's an interesting antenna, and it's certainly, if it's all tuned up properly, gives very good performance. There we are. That's my take on the quad. Bit of history there, bit of background information. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to press the subscribe button, and of course don't forget that here at Waterton Stanton we've got a wide range of products. No quads unfortunately in stock, at least not for HF, but we have got a wide range of equipment available. check our website, see our prices, and if you want to do a part exchange deal, pick up the phone, talk to one of our guys. Be more than happy to help you out. In the meantime, you enjoy your ham radio, you take care, and as usual, I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye for now.